Tonight, we begin with a strategy that U.S. intelligence officials had developed, diplomatic channels had prepared, and military planners had war-gamed for over a year. A campaign that unfolded not over years of incremental pressure, but in a matter of weeks. Weeks that saw Iran's last remaining trade partners begin to withdraw. Weeks that saw diplomatic missions recall from Tehran without explanation. Weeks that saw the Iranian rial collapse to historic lows. What Tehran did this quarter crossed a line that Washington had warned would trigger consequences. And when that line was crossed, the United States did not negotiate. They responded with precision, with coordination, and with a strategy that former CIA director and four-star General David Petraeus now says will push Iran into complete isolation by year's end. For nearly 2 years now, there have been signals, not public announcements, not official policy shifts, just signals, that Washington was assembling something comprehensive. The Iranian regime has been defiant, yes, but they have been strategic in their defiance. Their provocations have followed a certain logic, a cadence, almost a routine. But what set off alarm bells in Langley and the Pentagon this month was that Tehran broke from the routine entirely. Intelligence analysts who monitor Iranian behavior know the indicators. The frequency of IRGC communications with foreign militias, the volume of oil shipments through shadow fleets the pace of centrifuge installations, and foredial the tone of Friday sermons from regime-aligned clerics. All of that shifted dramatically. And whenever the Iranian regime shifts without warning, it means they're preparing for something they don't want Washington to see coming. Early this month, State Department officials detected what they described as a coordinated diplomatic offensive by Tehran, including outreach to nations that had not engaged with Iran in over a decade. These are the kinds of moves that Iran only makes when they are signaling something very specific: desperation, recalculation, or preparation for a major escalation. American officials didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it represented all three simultaneously. But what they did know was that Tehran was attempting to break out of its current constraints. And when a sanctioned regime begins frantically seeking new partnerships, even minor ones, Washington recognizes a pattern. That recognition has now translated into the most aggressive isolation campaign since 2019. The response coordinated by the Biden administration this month was not incremental. It was not symbolic. It was not designed for domestic optics. It was strategic. Officials after National Security Council meetings described Iran's diplomatic outreach as frantic, uncoordinated, and perhaps most importantly, a sign of a regime sensing its own vulnerability. But diplomatic maneuvering only works if potential partners are willing to engage. This time, they weren't. In fact, the international response to Washington's pressure campaign was among the most unified we've seen since the original JCPOA negotiations. Here's what we know. Within 2 weeks of detecting Iran's outreach, the Treasury Department expanded secondary sanctions to include any financial institution processing Iranian transactions. These weren't the targeted designations we've seen before. These were comprehensive restrictions, economic instruments that the U.S. only deploys when they are preparing to cut a nation off entirely from the global financial system. Tonight, administration officials confirmed that the United States has launched what they internally call maximum isolation, a campaign targeting not just Iran, but any nation willing to do business with Tehran. Washington moved before Iran could secure new partnerships. They pressured Beijing on Iranian oil purchases. They warned New Delhi about payment mechanisms. They sanctioned UAE-based front companies facilitating Iranian trade. They cut off Russian banks serving as intermediaries for Tehran. In other words, the U.S. targeted the escape routes. The back channels that would have allowed Iran to survive continued pressure. This is what made General Petraeus' assessment so striking. Iran's diplomatic offensive wasn't just ambitious. It was existential. It represented the kind of desperation that emerges when a regime recognizes its current trajectory is unsustainable. And Washington, understanding that fully, responded by closing every door. Not haphazardly, not reactively, but systematically. They didn't just sanction Iranian entities. They didn't just issue warnings. They made doing business with Iran economically radioactive. They made partnership with Tehran diplomatically toxic. And here's where the story becomes even more consequential. CIA analysts now believe that Iran's sudden diplomatic offensive was designed to test whether the international consensus against Tehran was weakening. The regime wanted to see whether rising oil prices and geopolitical fragmentation had created new openings. But instead, the opposite happened. The international community didn't fracture. They consolidated behind Washington with a speed and coordination that even State Department officials found remarkable. You don't get that kind of allied alignment easily. But this month, the United States achieved it. Former intelligence officials speaking with NBC News under anonymity described Iran's miscalculation as strategic blindness, a belief that global dynamics had shifted in their favor. But Washington proved this month that they retained both the leverage and the will to enforce isolation. Their diplomatic campaign was not only comprehensive, it was executed so precisely that 3 potential Iranian trade partners reversed course within 72 hours. That speed matters because it shows something fundamental. It shows that Washington is not merely containing Iran. They are systematically dismantling Tehran's remaining options. AS reports continued coming in throughout the week. We learned more about the scale of America's isolation campaign. The State Department secured commitments from 12 nations to downgrade diplomatic relations with Tehran, forcing the recall of Iranian ambassadors. The Treasury Department targeted shipping insurance companies, making it nearly impossible for Iranian oil tankers to operate in international waters. U.S. Cyber Command, operating in coordination with allied agencies, reportedly disrupted Iranian banking software used to process international transactions. This wasn't just sanctions. This wasn't just diplomatic pressure. This was systematic exclusion. This was economic strangulation on a scale we haven't seen since the lead-up to the JCPOA. And exclusion is the one thing the Iranian regime cannot survive long-term. For every workaround they have developed, cryptocurrency transactions, shell companies, barter arrangements, Washington has now deployed countermeasures that render them ineffective. Remember, Tehran thought the world was moving in their direction. They thought the Ukraine war had distracted Washington and divided the West. They thought rising energy prices gave them leverage. They thought China and Russia would provide a reliable alternative to Western markets. But this month, the exact opposite became clear. Washington is not distracted. The Western alliance is not divided. And even nations friendly to Tehran are unwilling to sacrifice their own economic interests to save the regime. What makes this moment so critical and so potentially volatile is that Iran's diplomatic offensive happened at a time when Supreme Leader Khamenei faces his most serious domestic challenges in decades. The Revolutionary Guard wants increased military spending. Reformists want economic normalization. The merchant class wants sanctions relief. And ordinary Iranians want basic stability. Khamenei is balancing these demands while inflation exceeds 40% and unemployment among young Iranians reaches catastrophic levels. And when leaders in that position make desperate moves, they're not operating from confidence. They're operating from fear. They're operating from the recognition that time is running out. The State Department statement, now communicated to every U.S. embassy worldwide, was designed to signal that Washington will not allow Iran to escape the consequences of its behavior. Secretary Blinken said plainly that Tehran's outreach efforts were fundamentally incompatible with responsible membership in the international community. That is diplomatic language for no one is coming to save you. You don't usually hear that level of finality from American diplomats unless the strategy has already been decided at the highest levels. Meanwhile, General David Petraeus addressed the Council on Foreign Relations in a measured but unmistakable assessment this week. He said, "The Iranian regime has fundamentally misread the current moment. They believe fragmentation would work in their favor." He said, "What we're now witnessing is the most comprehensive isolation campaign since the early 2010s, and it's accelerating." And he said, "By year's end, if this trajectory continues, Iran will face complete isolation, diplomatically, economically, and strategically." These are not casual observations. These are statements from a man who commanded forces in the Middle East and directed the Central Intelligence Agency. Here's what makes the situation even more precarious. Iran's diplomatic offensive wasn't isolated, along with their outreach to potential partners. Hezbollah increased weapons transfers to cells in Syria. The Houthis conducted their most sophisticated drone attack on Saudi infrastructure in months. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq issued explicit threats against U.S. personnel. All of this happened within the same 30-day window. When Tehran moves on multiple fronts simultaneously, it means they are preparing for the possibility that isolation becomes permanent. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Iran is preparing for direct negotiations, using escalation as leverage. Another is that Tehran is attempting to provoke a military response that would fracture the international coalition. A third possibility, the one keeping intelligence officials awake at night, is that Iran is accelerating its nuclear program as a hedge against complete isolation. But this month, Washington signaled they will not be deterred by any of these tactics. They didn't pause for negotiations. They didn't soften their approach after proxy attacks. They didn't offer off-ramps. They tightened the vice. What we're watching now is a test of endurance. Iran wants to see if Washington will maintain pressure through an election year. Washington wants to demonstrate that isolation is not a bargaining tactic. It's a strategy. Israel wants to ensure Iran never achieves nuclear capability. And Europe wants to prevent the collapse from becoming chaotic. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence officials who are now monitoring Iranian leadership communications around the clock. They say internal regime discussions have shifted from confidence to contingency planning. They say the speed of diplomatic abandonment has shocked even hardliners in Tehran. And they say Iran's decision to launch a diplomatic offensive backfired catastrophically, revealing their desperation to the very nations they hope to court. But Tehran is not surrendering. In fact, Tehran is recalculating. Their response in the coming weeks, whether escalation or accommodation, will determine whether Petraeus' prediction becomes reality. And it sent a message to the world that American resolve has not diminished as the final months of the year approach. We expect more details to emerge about what exactly Tehran hoped to achieve with their outreach. But what we do know is that Washington's response was decisive. It closed diplomatic doors Iran assumed would remain open. It demonstrated allied unity that Tehran believed had fractured, and it accelerated a timeline that the regime thought they could. What happens next will depend on what the Iranian leadership does before December. If they seek genuine negotiation, this moment may be remembered as a turning point. If they escalate further, Washington has already demonstrated they are prepared for that outcome as well. They have shown they are ready to see this through. And tonight, for the first time in years, Tehran appears to be genuinely uncertain about its path forward. The regime's diplomatic channels are quiet, too quiet. And when Iran goes quiet after a failed offensive, it means they are reassessing everything. It means they are confronting a reality they hope to avoid. Because this month, the Iranian regime learned something they can no longer deny. The world is not coming to their rescue. The alternatives they counted on do not exist. And complete isolation is no longer a threat. It is becoming their reality. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. The doors are closing. The options are vanishing. And by year's end, if General Petraeus is correct, the Iranian regime will stand entirely alone. And we will be here, watching every development as the final phase unfolds.